So I'm Roshi Joan Halifax, the abbot of Upaya Zen Center, and very grateful to Mind and Life Europe for joining the Varela International Symposium this year. This is a really significant year for Francisco's life, vision, work, and also for our community, which has expanded happily to include our European members. And I also want to offer a particular thanks to the core group who have been working together since 2009 in developing the Varela continuum, if you will, here at Upaya. We had this vision. This was Evan and Richie, John, Kazniak, and me to bring a special focus onto Francisco's work and to Francisco's influence on our lives in terms of our lives as contemplatives and also those who are scientists and philosophers in this small community, how Cisco overlit what we do as contemplatives, philosophers, and scientists. So I especially want to thank John, Al, Evan, who else is it? Richie. You know, our little core group. Year after year, we've made our pilgrimage to Upaya. It's just been wonderful to be in this physical crucible of Upaya. But last year and this year, we went online because of the pandemic. And also because of the pandemic and marking the publication, 30 years since the publication of Francisco, Eleanor Roche's and Evan Thompson's book on the embodied mind, and then 20 years since Francisco died. This is a time for us to, if you will, take stock of Francisco's influence on our lives and also on our work. And because of the pandemic, many questions have arisen around issues related to what is happening globally. Also, not just the pandemic, climate emergency as well. And so we decided to put our focus on an exploration of uncertainty and emergence in self and society. And so that is what we are going to be plunging into over the next few days. And I'm going to just also say, in addition to the content, which I know is going to be very powerful, there will be times in the early morning and in the late afternoon for practice. And we'll have practice moments, meditation moments throughout our time together. Because one of the things is this is not an academic conference. This is a kind of consort, coming together where we as people who have been deeply influenced by Francisco's life and work can explore actively with each other and with you what we see unfolding in terms of Francisco's work at this time. And I'd like to introduce Amy Cohen-Varela, who is president of the Mind and Life Europe, my good friend for many, many years. We have stirred the waters, we collaborated in all kinds of ways, and she's one of my most beloved and dearest friends. And Amy La.
Thank you so much, Roshi, for that beautiful introduction. And actually, it's been decades.
It has.
So thank you very much for the lovely introduction. I'm the chair of the board of Mind and Life Europe, and so I'm wishing you all a wonderful welcome. Thank you for all being here. From Mind and Life Europe, its board, its members, its community. And I'm extremely happy that we have this partnership with Upaya that is simply a continuation of all of the interchanges that we've had with Roshi Joan and people from the Upaya world at our symposium and at various other events. So it feels to me a little bit like a one big family, which feels very, very nice. And so Roshi, you mentioned the 20 years of Francisco's passing and the 30 years of the publication of The Embodied Mind. This partnership is part of a program that we're running this year that I just wanted to mention a couple of things about at Mind and Life Europe. That's called Varela and Friends, Embodiment and Enaction 2030. So it's dedicated to this year, which will be a year in effect of revisioning Francisco's legacy. And perhaps even more important, but they go together, seeing where we go from here, which is a big question these days. So in the context of this 30th anniversary of the publication of The Embodied Mind and the 20th of Francisco's passing, we just have we have a number of programs. I'm just going to mention them with very little detail, but just so that you know to have a look at them if you go onto the Mind and Life Europe website. We have a series of wonderful seminars that we're doing in cooperation with the University of Slovenia at Ljubljana with a philosopher named Sebastian Boros, which are called the Uraguro Seminars. And in fact, two people here and our speakers are participating in that seminar, Evan Thompson and Hannah Jaeger. There are a number of other speakers. What we're doing at those seminars is something that we do maybe too little, which is some really amazing close readings of Francisco's work. And then discussing with a closed group, but quite a big group that has a lot of excellent scientists, philosophers, scholars, and students, the ramifications and the implications of this work for what we can do in the future. So that's Ouroboros there. You can see the recordings of the past sessions. There have been 3, but we'll go through December. And they're all on our YouTube, our Mind and Life Europe YouTube channel. And then just a few more things. We have in the context of Varela and Friends 2030, we also have we had actually a 5-day residential colloquium at Cerisy, which is a very famous conference center in France. So everybody listening from France will know about that. And it's a beautiful place, a 17th century castle where people get together and spend a number of days in residence on a subject, talking about a subject. And that we had to cancel this year. So we're having it next year in August. We'll announce that properly as it gets closer. But so August 2022. But along with the Cerisy team, the Mind and Life Europe team is setting up a tribute day, which will be a full online day of, the French call it the apéro. You could call it the kickoff. You could call it a foretaste of what will come in August 2022. We have many of the speakers who we expected this year, but who are, since the event is not being held, will not be there, who will be coming in to give 15, 20-minute short talks about what their interest is in Francisco's legacy and in different aspects of his life. And this will include his scientific legacy, his philosophical legacy, and as well as lots of images coming from his time in Dharamsala with the Dalai Lama and his time in France in particular. So that will be on May 20th, and you can find out all the information about that on our YouTube channel. And finally, last but not least, far from least, we are launching in June a webinar series that we've called Francisco and Friends, an embodiment of relationship, to which we are inviting a number of people, including Roshi Joan, who also Wolf Singer, John Kabat-Zinn. We have 9 or 10 people coming in to do a monthly webinar on their friendship and relationship, working and living with Francisco as a way of treating this a little personally this year, this particular year. And we're very lucky to have the kickoff, the launch of this series, Francisco and Friends, will be done by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which is fantastic, on June 9th. Followed up closely on his heels will be Evan Thompson on June 14th, who will talk to us about the conception and life from his perspective of the book, The Embodied Mind. So this is the general framework. There are other things, you can check out the website, but I want to thank Roshi Joan and Upaya for partnering with us in this rather extraordinary set of activities we have for this year, and we have plans also for next year, but in particular this very special year. So thank you.
Amy, thank you so much. And I also want to thank Nirakara and the Association for the Development of Mindfulness. I dare not pronounce it in my fractured French, but in any case, for offering translation for the symposium. So generous of you, and I've really deeply appreciated our collaboration. So one person I would like to introduce, and that is Gabor. And Gabor is the new director of Mountain Life in Europe. Maybe Gabor, if you could just share a few words, I'd so appreciate it.
Thank you, Roshi. Thank you, Amy, for the wonderful introduction and this wonderful program. And I would just simply repeat what Amy has said, that this is a very special year in Europe for us to remember Francisco, to study his work, and to continue in the footsteps of his wonderful achievements, and ask major new questions that we are pondering about these days with regards to those questions that are the topic of this particular symposium as well: self and society, uncertainty, how to face that with action, with thinking, with explorations, and how to develop a better, more friendly relationship with each other that would probably enhance our capacity to live a better life with each other and with nature as well. So I don't want to add more, because this is the very topic that you are exploring in this particular symposium that is at the center for thinking and discussion these days at Mind and Life Europe as well. Thank you, Roshi.
Thank you, Gabor. And it's been great working with you on this particular project. I'm really so grateful for your precision and your responsiveness and your vision.
Thank you.
So as I said, this year, we wanted to explore the convergence and presence of uncertainty and emergence in self and society. And what we asked our presenters to do, which was, to give a title and then a brief write-up. And in looking at the write-ups of each of our presentations, I was fascinated that throughout each person's content, there was a theme that tied everything together. And that theme is love. And, in a world that we are experiencing right now, where there is such profound polarization, to have our philosophers and our scientists reference love in the way that they have in the précis of their presentations moved me deeply. So I'm going to ask each of our presenters to briefly share the title of their presentation and the direction that they're going to be pursuing in their content. And I'd like to invite Evan to begin, since you are going to be our first presenter tomorrow morning. And welcome, Ev. Just, for those of you who don't know, Ev and I have known each other probably longer than you knew Francisco, I think. I don't know, but since you were about 13 years old.
That's right.
And how beautiful we have sustained the landscape of discovery between us. I love you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and that is true. I am the first speaker, so I guess I get to launch into this by being the first one to say a few things about what I'm going to talk about. The title of my talk is Enacting Hope and Coordinated Knowing. And some of you may have heard the Dharma talk that I gave on Wednesday, the day before yesterday, which was simply called Enacting Hope. So that was a much, that talk was entirely devoted to hope. So if you're interested in some of the maybe larger philosophical background of some of the things I'm going to say tomorrow, you can have a listen to that talk. But what I'm going to do in the talk tomorrow is I'm taking the term coordinated knowing from an indigenous American philosopher who contrasts coordination epistemology and crisis epistemology. And this person is Kyle White, a really remarkable thinker who's also participating in the Mind and Life Summer Research Institute in June, the North American Mind and Life Summer Research Institute. And one of the fundamental points he makes is that crisis epistemology, where we feel an urgency to act and think in a linear means end way, is a way of responding to uncertainty that can unintentionally bring about harms and can distort our perceptions. And he contrasts this with what he calls coordination epistemology, which is based in love and kinship relations. And he presents that as a different perspective for framing time, for framing action, for framing our worldview in relationship to each other and to nature. So I'm going to be using those ideas, linking them back to some old ideas about ecology and epistemology coming from Gregory Bateson, who of course was very influential on Francisco Varela's thinking. And I'm going to be weaving that into some thoughts about the enactive approach in cognitive science, which emphasizes emergence and relationality, and relating that to ideas about love and about hope, not in the sense of optimism or hoping for a particular outcome, but rather as an open and patient stance informed by love and toward the good that really arises out of what Kyle White would call a kinship or coordination epistemology. So those are the ideas that I'm going to be playing with tomorrow.
Hey, Ev, thank you so much. I want to introduce you now to the physicist Adam Frank, a close friend of Evan's, now a friend of ours and mine at Upaya, and also a Zen practitioner who's working on koans. Adam is going to be doing a talk called Planetary Intelligence in 3 acts. Adam.
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to give this talk. So greetings, everyone, from the deck of the Rocinante, the former Martian frigate. If you know what that is, we're now best friends. So my talk comes from some research that I'm involved in, which has actually been spurred by my other times at the Varela Symposium. And it's the idea of how planets evolve, how planets with life, how the physical systems and the biosphere, the biological systems, co-evolve together, and how intelligence may be part of this the whole way through. The pandemic has demonstrated to us the ways in which we have formed some kind of global technosphere, some kind of global collective intelligence that is still, while it has taken control, it doesn't know what to do with that control in some sense, or taken stewardship. It is a blind stewardship. And what I'm interested in is the ways in which intelligence can be seen as something which may have been part of the evolution of the planet from the beginning. And this speaks to some of the work, the people here who were involved with Lindsafar, I wasn't, but the idea is that Francisco and other people who were involved in Lindsafar were talking about, 30 years ago, particularly Lynn Margulis and Lovelock, and the idea of Gaia. And there were so many ways in which those thinkers, the people here as well, were so far ahead of their time, because now we recognize that the basic idea of Gaia, whether or not there's full self-regulation or not, is most likely true not only on Earth, but we are using it to think also about other planets as well. So the three acts that I'm interested in planetary intelligence are the study of Earth and the study of exoplanets, the idea of when life emerges on any world, do you get the biosphere forming a kind of collective intelligence, regardless of whether or not there's any tool building dolphins or whatever. The second act is what's happening to us now, that clearly we have intelligence on the planet, well, some form. And yet we're struggling with the consequences of what our intelligence has wrought on the planet with a very uncertain future. So that's the second act, is to sort of understand how, from the first act, how intelligence might emerge and a cognition on collective scales. And then ask, how does that apply to what we're trying to build now? And the third act is aliens, because I can't give a talk without talking about aliens. And that's really the idea of what are called techno-signatures. So I'm very involved in the scientific search for exo-civilizations, which is really ramping up right now. There's a lot of, there's actually funding for it. And so the idea that any civilization that is long lasting has to have developed some kind of feedback mechanisms where there is a interaction between the biosphere and what we can call the technosphere. So I'll talk a little bit about the idea of the technosphere. And that to be long-lived, to have a civilization that can last for thousands of years, must mean coming into some kind of cooperative, loving relationship with the biosphere. The biosphere can't be treated as, the place just to dump your waste. And so I'm very interested in how that can happen, what a planet that has that characteristics will look like, and what it means for us in terms of looking for those civilizations. And most importantly, how can we, even if we're only doing this theoretically, how can we learn from what we think a long-term civilization and its biosphere must look like? So I'm very excited to be able to present this work to you, and I thank you again for the opportunity.
No, thanks, Adam. And moving from the planetary to the personal, I invite Amy, who will do the next presentation in the sequence that we will be following Saturday and Sunday. Her presentation is on uncertainty, living systems, and grieving.
Thank you, Roshi. Yes, we're moving inward, I think, very much into the personal. What I will be trying to do is also some weaving. I'm very inspired by Francisco and others thinking about life and autonomous systems. I've also been more recently very inspired by the work of Hannah de Jager, who's here with us, and others who are working with her in what's called participatory sense making, which I think she'll be talking about, which is a development in some ways of an action, but I'll let her explain that. And in terms of, I was thinking about what to offer here about the idea of the grieving process as being a way of traversing, of crossing over through uncertainty to somewhere. And so in some ways, the weaving that I'm going to be doing between enactive cognitive science and autonomy and the more psychoanalytic or psychological material that I have from my work is tentative, but it's a shot. And what I was thinking about was grieving as being considered to be a very private experience, and mostly considered to be something that needs to be curtailed or diminished or excluded in our societies, in our Western societies. And also mourning or grieving is a process that ends when you've replaced the lost object by another object. And the fact is that when you grieve, when most people have, or when you work with people who are grieving, you know that it's much, much more than a private individual process, and that it is thoroughly relational. with the others who are around you, and with your internal others. And so grief makes the psyche work. Grief calls upon the psyche to go beyond its identity as it's organized and configured in connection with the other by internalizing traces of the other who has been lost. And so this, in some ways, lodges otherness at the center of the self. And so I'm going to be doing some thinking about how that process works, relating it to some ideas coming from participatory sense making, and thinking at the end about the notion of what it means actually to welcome an internal other in grieving, for how we can welcome others from the outside under conditions that we're going to need to be able to welcome them given the conditions that we're living in. And I'm thinking of welcoming conditions like climate migration and all of the things that are going to befall us, that are going to entail that we rethink our way of receiving others into our lives. So that's the general gist. Thank you.
Amy, thank you. It's so relevant to what's happening today. John, I would like to ask you to share the title of your presentation and just a brief overview.
Thanks, Roshi. Looking forward to this weekend. I'll have to, just a quick note to, if you see me disappear, I've got to go give a talk to the Wisconsin Department of Administration. So we'll see what they think of me. But in the meantime, for the Varela Symposium, this is really an exciting weekend where we have an amazing crew, and I wish I could just sit back and watch. But I guess I'll be saying something too. And the title of my talk is "What We See Is Not Water, What We Believe Is Not True." And in this regard, perhaps I might be a bit of an outlier on the issue of love. You know, the Beatles famously said, all you need is love. And my talk is about the fact that that's not all you need. Actually, you also need wisdom. And especially the wisdom that I'm talking about here is actually the wisdom of uncertainty itself, of being what was sometimes called tolerating, the kshanti, the tolerance of the uncertain. And that actually is something that can be very disturbing for us, because what we find actually is that our sense of reality, the very givenness of our reality, the seeming objectivity of our reality, just, you know, is something that even gets under the skin, quite literally. But in fact, from a Buddhist perspective, the claim is that our reality is something that's communally constructed. It's constructed together with other minds, but it is not objectively real. There is, in a sense, no real world that we can escape to, that we can hope for. And one of the ways this is illustrated is by a famous example of where what humans see as water, the hungry ghosts see as pus, and the gods see as nectar. And this idea of there being a kind of perspectival nature of reality is really meant to be confronted in that moment of seeing through the apparent truth of everything that we take to be real and dear, especially actually what we think to be the good or the beautiful. So I'm going to be, in a sense, trying to a little bit raise the question of, when we are creating realities together, is our goal to create the one final true reality? Is there a final true reality? Are we going to have a sort of, you know, world government or a Gaia that is a single mind with a single truth and a single beauty? Or do we actually need a kind of diversity that's built into our sense of love? And can we even have a kind of love that is not based on exclusion? Is it possible to really have a completely inclusive love? Does that make sense? Does it make sense even evolutionarily? So those are the kinds of questions I'll be raising. We'll see what I end up actually saying. But for the moment, that's what I think I'll say.
John, this is one of the reasons I love you, because I never know. You know, you're a loose cannon. I don't know ever where you're going to go, but it's always someplace that all of us need to go, whether we like it or not. So John, thank you so much. Richie, I'd like to invite you to give the title and then just a little bit about what you're going to be covering.
Well, thank you, Roshi, and it's great to be here. And as I've said to our small group. I always look forward to reflecting on and preparing for these talks at Upaya, because they're very different than any other talks I give. And it's a real opportunity in an unconstrained or differently constrained, shall I say, way to bring science and Dharma together. And so the current title of my talk is Gleaning the Path from Contemplative Neuroscience, Predictive Coding, Self, and the Practical Possibility of Microdosing at Scale. And by microdosing here, I'm referring to the microdosing of contemplative practice. This is a serious issue, which I've actually begun thinking a lot about and regard actually as an urgent public health need. And so I'll be weaving together both very basic science as well as issues of contemporary concern of a very practical sort. I'll be talking about two fundamental pillars of well-being that are part of a framework that we're thinking a lot about. The first pillar being awareness, and another pillar, insight. The first pillar is really about self-awareness in part, and the insight pillar is about self-knowledge. I'll talk about how those are related to one another, some of the neuroscientific considerations which are relevant to understanding how the brain may be associated with each of them, and that will lead to issues about how the self is constructed, and then talk about the evolution of the path and bring some neuroscientific evidence to bear on variations in neural correlates of contemplative practice that change over time and that eventually lead to a, in a predictive coding sense, to completely let go of predictions, which then uncovers, I think, the natural state of the mind, if you will. And this is where I think love is relevant and important. So this will be very far-ranging, and the details will unfold as they do. And I just want to express my deepest appreciation to you, Roshi, and to all of our co-conspirators in enabling this kind of opportunity. So really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, dear Richie, thank you so much. So I'd like to invite Elena Antonova. Share your title and just a brief overview, please.
Thank you. Thank you. My title is Being Like the Writing on the Water. And I'm not going to argue that water is something that we do perceive and that is absolutely existing, not to contradict John Donne's talk, but I'm just using the water as a metaphor of fluidity in its liquid state. And I'm playing with the notion of attractors in physical systems that have been also developed as a kind of principle of brain organization in neuroscience, starting with people like Walter Freeman, and then linking recent research in spontaneous, the sort of resting state networks, also referred to as intrinsic connectivity networks, to this idea of kind of hidden attractors that govern this seemingly spontaneous brain activity. And I'm going to use this framework to show that in experience, mindfulness meditators, mindfulness as we kind of secularly define, there is a greater fluidity of neural dynamics. And this greater fluidity is linked to adaptivity, because we also know that in various psychopathologies, there is a tendency to be stuck in a particular mode of relating to the world and oneself. And this kind of indicates entrenched attractors that keep on pulling the system to certain patterns of behavior. So attractors are kind of being a pattern of behavior of the system that limits its behavioral repertoire to a certain set of patterns. And so this ability to shift between the patterns is very much facilitated by mindfulness practice. And I would conclude by stating that if we need to have any entrenched attractors, then we only need three. One is relevant or synonymous to what John Donne termed as the wisdom of uncertainty itself, which for me echoes the concept of groundlessness in the embodied mind, this sort of ability just to stay with the question, stay with the uncertainty, staying with the constant unfolding of things, not knowing, and being very comfortable in that, with the love being a kind of the other side of the coin of that way of being. Because if we're truly resting in uncertainty, if we're truly resting in that groundlessness, without having to come up with some kind of answer, without having to come up with models of, of the world, to dovetail on what Richie said, then love is the highest wisdom. And if we then to express this way of being in relationship to each other, that is the compassionate action.
Thank you so much, Elena. You know, and the image that I have is, you've shared this work, is of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, who rides the waves of birth and death. So I want to invite Hanna de Jager to please share the title of her presentation and also an overview. It's our ultimate or last presentation, I think very appropriate as a way of bringing all the threads together.
Okay. Yeah, thank you also from me very much for inviting me to be here. My title is An Active Epistemology and an Active Ethics, Ways of Participating. But actually the title is really Loving and Knowing, because that's what I will be talking about. I will introduce my concept of participatory sense-making, like Amy said, which follows from Francisco's work on sense-making and Evan and Eleanor Roche's work. And that's about our social relations. But I think that understanding of participatory sense-making needs to be deepened, both for how an individual participates and what happens as the emerging interaction between people. And I will try to deepen that idea by thinking about loving and knowing, but as it happens between people, and also the difficulties, the paradoxes, and the uncertainty and the ambiguity of what happens in loving relationships. So I can sense that maybe I will feel some friction with some of the ideas of loving that we will be using during the seminar, and I want to bring that forward and also talk about how difficult it is to love and to know each other, and that is actually important for dealing with uncertainty, I think, as well. Like John said, maybe we cannot have an inclusive love, but maybe that's itself generative of something that's needed as well. That's what I will be talking about.
Thank you, Hanna, so much. So I want to introduce Dr. Al Kazniak, who has been the ballast in first the Zen Brain, now the Varela Symposium. And Al, if you could just say a few words about, why we chose this theme this year. And I also just have to thank you for all the work you do under the hood of the symposium to make everything happen, to herd the cats, to get the schedule together, to keep the vision directed. So, Al.
Thanks, Roshi. So, as we typically do in thinking about these Varela symposia, we literally start the planning process on the day that the previous year's symposium ends. And that involves thinking about what individuals we might like to add to the core group that Roshi described previously. How is it that we want to select the kinds of persons who can really bring an interactive chemistry together so that what emerges, to use that term that's really focus for us this year, what emerges is something that we can't predict from the beginning. And of course, as we thought about a theme for this year, not only the 20th anniversary of Francisco Varela's death and the 30th anniversary of the book with Evan and with Elena Roche, but also our situation, our collective situation. It's clear to everyone that the world is now, perhaps always was, but certainly it's clear is now very unpredictable. How do we understand that? How do we understand what emerges from the complex systems that are at the basis of our biology, through mind-brain, through societies, and through the cosmos? What emerges at each of those, as it were, levels of complex organization? And what does that say to how we think about the ways we dance with or relate to uncertainty, a topic you heard several of the presenters specifically addressing? That's what they'll be talking about. So it became very clear early on that this particular topic was very timely. Roshi and I are very grateful for the willingness of all of the faculty who are participating this year, without hesitation to really jump on board and think extraordinarily deeply and interactively about what we're going to be doing the next couple of days. As Roshi said, my role in particular is primarily what happens before we begin and launch these organizationally, as well as thinking about how to structure the flow, the arc of the symposium to maximize that interactivity that we so depend upon in these symposia. And then I'll be keeping an eye on where those connections might be. How can we draw those out? How can we stimulate interaction between the faculty members, but also as we move along with those of you who are the participants in the symposium. So I'll stop there and just again express my gratitude to Roshi. We've been doing these a long time now. I had a lot less gray hair when we started.
Same here.
But I really so appreciate every year is just a source of extraordinary growth. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Al. 50 years ago or 49 years ago, our friend William Irwin Thompson founded the Lindisfarne Fellowship. And Bill died this year. But Lindisfarne was a vessel that allowed for many of us, including Bateson, Schumacher, Francisco, and myself and others, to come together. And Evan grew up in Lindisfarne, if you will, and to leap off that 100-foot pole year after year as we explored each other's ideas and endeavors. And it was really, I think, in the vessel of Lindisfarne that our Zen Center was born, and also Mind and Life. And then 40 years ago, in 1981, Francisco and I had a conversation at Stanford University in a very remarkable meeting on order and disorder. which Ilya Prigozhin and Kenneth Arrow and Francisco and others were participating, about the possibility of dialogues happening between His Holiness and neuroscientists. And that conversation in part is reflected by us being together now. And then 30 years ago, the book that Cisco, Evan, and Eleanor Roche did on the embodied mind, groundbreaking book, and also influenced by the work of Umberto Maturana, who recently died, another great who we have lost this year. And then Cisco's passing. So I believe that one of the most important aspects of the founding of Mind and Life, both in the United States and in Europe, is how Francisco embodied in his life, in his work and in his very disposition, the disciplines of neuroscience, the practice and philosophy of Buddhism, and also of Western philosophy. And that I could see over the many years that I knew Cisco, and also saw Francisco interacting with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, that His Holiness cherished Francisco's blazing mind, his warm heart, and also his courage. And I believe it was this love, actually, between Cisco and His Holiness that made it possible for so many of us to bring the work of the weave of the philosophical, the phenomenological, the contemplative, the neuroscience, social psychology, and also this deep exploration into complex adaptive systems. And I feel like that the trust that Cisco and His Holiness shared, their respect for each other, and this mutual sense of discovery has influenced all of us. Somehow we have, as individuals, but also as friends, caught the wind of the spirit of these two remarkable individuals. And our lives have been deeply enriched by being in association with both Francisco and His Holiness. So I would like to invite Amy to reflect for just a little bit on Francisco's vision and work, how it touched her life. I'm going to ask Hannah and Elena to say something, and hopefully Richie. And we'll be concise, but we know that there's a kind of overlighting of all of us by Francisco's person, but also his vision. So Amy.
Well, as you know, as most of you know, I got to know him before I got to know his work. Actually, it happened in parallel. And I was thinking about this conference, I was reminiscing about it, and also because of something that Hannah said to me in one of our meetings with Gabor, that I actually met Francisco at a family therapy meeting that I was invited to speak at as a psychoanalyst who was working at the intersection between psychoanalysis and literature. And this group of family therapists was very inspired by Bateson and Václavík, as many of the systems family therapists are and were at the time. This was in the mid 80s, and I remember watching him give the talk. That was what I was thinking about, watching this person that I had no idea of who he was giving this talk. And he was in the talk, since it was for a lay audience in terms of cognitive science, or a relative lay audience, he was talking about the alternative that he was proposing to the dominant computationalist formulation for cognition that he roundly critiqued and discussed network processes and emergent processes. And as I was thinking about this, I don't have the talk anymore, or I don't have the copy of the talk anymore, but I remember him mentioning a book that many of you might know at the time. It had just come out, which was Marvin Minsky's The Society of Mind, which was a book that really influenced Francisco a lot. And I remember, I don't know, sometime after our first date, he gave me that book. And later I got to meet Marvin Minsky, which is a rare joy. And then in the second part of the talk, he talked about how this notion of networks, so he kind of, in the first part of the talk, he kind of threw over everything that I thought about the brain. And then in the second part of the talk, he threw over everything that I thought about the immune system. And in the second part of the talk, he developed a little bit the work that he was doing at that time, actually in Paris at the Pasteur Institute with a group working on the immune system. And I guess throwing over or defying what he called the fortress defense model, which is that the body is this fortress, and the primary function of the immune system is to defend it by sending out its little military antibodies to attack anything that might come in. And he presented an alternative that many people who know about autonomous systems know about, which was the idea that the immune system is a cognitive system that's much more oriented to conversation than it is to fighting. And so he developed his idea that he would develop later, a few years later, on the immune system as being a kind of somatic identity rather than primarily a defense mechanism for the body or foreign. And so my first impression of him was this. I wasn't sure that I'd gotten everything, but this was an iconoclast. And I knew he was destroying. I wasn't 100% clear on what he was offering, but those were the things that I heard. And I knew that he was offering me a way of thinking, and at least even at that time, metaphors for thinking differently. And that came out very, very clearly from that very first meeting before I even started exploring in any depths whatsoever what he was talking about for the rest of his days, in fact. And then, so we had a life together, which was kind of like an unending discussion. Not really talking about how he influenced me, because that would take too long, but I think that this notion of his way, what Elena mentioned about this very, very openness he had to uncertainty and being able to hold questions open, and then, but also to be able to recognize received notions that didn't have backing that he appreciated and just sweep them away, it made every contact with him an event. He was eventful. And even talking to him, that it was eventful. And I just had one more memory that I wanted to share with you, given the day and who's here and all that, which was a few months after we met, Francisco gave me this thick sheaf of printer paper, the kind of paper we used in the old days that had these perforated edges that you had to kind of peel off. This was in the mid 80s.
Dot matrix printers.
Yeah, and so you spend all your time with all these strechels of paper on the floor, So anyway, he handed me this, and I pulled all the edges off, and he asked me to read it. And then later that week, it might have been that week, it might have been the following week, I opened the door, and Francisco was expecting him, but I wasn't, and there was Evan Thompson. And Francisco pulled out the sheaf and said, "Let's go." And it was a draft of The Embodied Mind. And I, of course, had read it through. It was a first reading, but I had the absolute joy and luck of being able to talk with Francisco and Evan at this stage of The Embodied Mind, which at the time was called Worlds Without Grounds. So this notion of groundlessness, which remained in there, was actually built into the title from the very beginning. So those were just a few little stories I wanted to share to try to indirectly communicate the inspiration he was.
I just want to quickly insert in there, just because it came up, that the Worlds Without Ground title, my dad actually came up with.
That's right.
So we asked him for, what do you think? Because he's very good at titles. We asked him, well, what should we call this? And he said, well, what about Worlds Without Ground? So that was his doing. And then it changed later, but that was the original idea.
Thanks, Ev. I see that we're almost out of time. I wonder if I could ask Hannah, Elena, and Richie just for a brief reflection, and then you, Evan, just in conclusion on how Cisco's work has touched your work in your life. So maybe beginning with Hannah.
Yes, so I have no direct connection with Francisco. I got to know his work very young, nevertheless, so that shows how far his work was traveling, because I was, my father was studying in the early 80s to become a systems therapist in a place in Belgium, which was called the Interactie Academie, the Interaction Academy. And so as a young child over dinner, we had discussions about meta thinking and social interactions and the importance of them, and also about understanding people's experience and what is at stake for them from their perspective. And this was very much inspired by Francisco and Humberto Maturena's work, which so since I was a young child, that was present in the conversations I had and my thinking. And then later on, I went to do my degree in philosophy, and I studied autopoiesis and cognition there. And I then linked that to artificial intelligence and how autistic people think. And that led me to do a PhD at the University of Sussex, where again, Francisco Varela's work was very important and very central to what many people there were doing. Ezekiel Di Paolo as well, and many other people who are now activists were there working on this, on these ways of thinking. So there's a long stream without any actual connection, but in another part of the world, this was already very present since the early 80s. So that's my connection. And then, of course, I started meeting people like Evan, and but that's kind of my personal story in a way with Francisco's work.
Thank you, Hannah. Elena.
Thank you. I never had the fortune of meeting Francisco in person. I had the fortune to hear a lot of personal stories from Amy, for which I'm very grateful. But before I came across Francisco's work, I already had some strange connections building up with him. And one of them is as an undergraduate psychology student in London at UCL, University College London, where, as in many sort of experimental psychology bachelors of science courses, they incredibly dominated by cognitive psychology paradigm. And I remember sort of my soul gradually drying from constant analogies of mind as a computer, and all this kind of functionalist ideas about what mind is. And I was already brewing with a kind of being Russian by my background, sort of the revolutionary was boiling in me to overturn the paradigm. And I coined this term experiential neuroscience, and designed a little logo for what my lab was going to be when I finished my PhD. And my colloquial name, or Elena, is something that not easily remembered or pronounced in my interactions in the UK. So I became colloquially known as Lena. So my lab was Lab of Experiential Neurosciences and Analysis. And so then when I learned about Francisco's work, I was struggling to remember how the embodied mind got into my hands. In my second year of the psychology course, I became interested in Buddhism and became a sort of DIY meditator. And so when the embodied mind finally got into my hands, I was just so inspired and so resonating with every word. And I felt like I was reading between the words. And I thought, these guys must be Buddhists. At least they must know about Buddhism. And I also realized that Evan was in Toronto, and I almost got to do my undergraduate degree in Toronto. It would have been interesting how my path might have developed were to study there. And then, you know, through various events, it was meeting Amy and Michelle Bitbol at a conference in London dedicated to 10 years of Francisco's passing.
2011.
The following year, my first summer research institute, where I had the fortune of meeting Roshi and Al and Evan and Richie and John. So that kind of keeps on enriching my life in many wonderful ways. And my path with Francisco's thought is forever intertwined.
Elena, thank you. Richie, just briefly, and then Ev, if you would finish up, and then I'll just do a quick review of what we're going to be up to today.
Very good. I'll make this brief. I first met Francisco, I'm not sure what year, but it was in the late 1970s or early 1980s in New York City. And we both found ourselves in the laboratory of Eroy John, a wild neuroscientist. And we were together given an assignment by Roy John of figuring out how to discover the duration of a perceptual moment. And it was my first introduction to Francisco. And that was really wonderful. And then fast forward about 10 years later, we were rooming together at Kashmir Cottage in Dharamsala. And I will never forget this first night when we arrived. And I remember Francisco going out and taking a really deep breath on the terrace there. Some of you have been there. And he had a t-shirt on. This is a very vivid memory. And then he started talking to me about his practice. And it was, for me, at that stage of my life, it just thoroughly penetrated and really deeply affected me. It was just an incredible moment because I had been meditating for many years before that, but it was it marked a turning point for me in my path and my commitment to the integration of the serious integration of science and Dharma.
Oh, Richie, what a beautiful memory. I think I stood on that terrace with you and Francisco in '92. What a time. Evan. I don't know if Evan,
yeah, there's so many things one could say, but two things that come into my mind. And they both date from that time in New York City when Richie was visiting Francisco. So one is that the experiment that Francisco went on to do to measure the duration of a perceptual moment, I was a subject in. I was 15 years old at the time. And another story from that period that I don't know if I've told any of you is, so this was at the Lindisfarne Association, and there was a lecture given by a philosopher, a visiting lecturer by a philosopher, a public lecture, and it was on Plato. And there was a discussion of Plato's theory of the forms. And I had been studying classical Greek and philosophy at the time. And after the lecture was over, Francisco said to me, "So what did you think of the lecture?" And I said, "Well, I really think she got Plato wrong. I don't think that's actually what Plato means when he talks about the forms. And Francisco said, oh, that's very interesting. So then we went and we were just sitting in the living room with the speaker, and the speaker turned to me and said, "What did you think of my lecture?" And I said something like, "Oh, I was very happy to hear it. I enjoyed it." After the speaker had left, Francisco took me aside and he said, "You shouldn't have done that. You should have told her what you thought. You know something about this. You have an opinion. She asked you, you should tell her." And this really stuck in my mind over the years. And I have to say, for those of you who know that, my most recent book is called Why I'm Not a Buddhist, and it's a critique of things in Buddhist modernism that as a philosopher I find unsatisfactory. Those words hung over me as I wrote that book. I really heard Francisco saying those words to me. And I wrote the book in a way where I imagined Francisco there as somebody that I wanted to, express these thoughts to and have a conversation with. So his absence was very much a presence in that work that many people might think of as being in some ways removed from him. Actually, it's very, very close to him and in a very immediate personal way that comes from those words he said to me when I was 15 years old.
And that's a really beautiful story. It reminds me of a talk I went to at the École Polytechnique that Francisco was giving, or more like combat, where he stood in this pit, and all these French academics were, up there in the bleachers attacking him, and he did them in one, one after another. I mean, there was just bodies everywhere. And one of the things I think many of us have appreciated about Francisco is, in his way, he took no prisoners. So, my dears, we have a very dense, rich agenda ahead of us. For our European friends, just so you know, at 5:30 rather, Mountain Time, we'll enjoy a period of just simple meditation. And then from 7 to 8, Al, you have the schedule, right? From 7 to 8.
Yes.
Our US people, all you Europeans will probably be in bed, but our US community with Richie and John, Al, me, and Adam, Evan, will be opening up the content. We're opening up the treasure house, if you will, for what we'll be exploring in the next 2 days. And just so you know, at tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Mountain Time, there will be a guided meditation guided by me on Saturday, and then on Sunday by Al. And then we gather at 10 o'clock, and there are 2 presentations and then discussion and alchemizing around those presentations in the morning, 2 to 4 in the afternoon on Saturday, in the same schedule on Sunday. So I also deeply encourage you to go to the resource page, where you'll find all this information and papers and other content that I think will be very, edifying for you. And I want to thank Amy, Gabor, our translators, so grateful, and our presenters for being in the weave of this. And we look forward to seeing you over these next 2 days.